Okay, let's unpack this. 22 out of 33 Latin American countries are now part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. That was early 2024 data. 22. I mean, that's not just a number, is it? It really makes you ask, what's actually going on here for Latin America? And what does that mean for the U.S.?
Exactly. That's the core of our deep dive today. China's influence in Latin America, it's growing fast. And it's not just the Belt and Road or BRI, it's the whole picture. Their economic moves, their strategic plays. We're aiming to give you a clear sense of what this means for development there and, for the relationships with both China and the U.S.
Right. And we've pulled together a lot of different views for this. We're talking reports from the Council on Foreign Relations, the Wilson Center, the Inter-American Dialogue.
Manga Bay for the environmental side, Brookings, even some legal perspectives from the University of Miami, Inter-American Law Review, EUI blogs.
Yeah, and we even dipped into some Reddit threads for on-the-ground perspectives. The goal here for you, the learner, is really to cut through the noise, give you a clear view of this pretty complex geopolitical scene, hit the key impacts, the surprising bits, without getting totally bogged down in detail. So let's start with the BRI itself in Latin America. How did this all unfold?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative, China launched it back in 2013, right? It's this huge global plan focused on infrastructure, connecting economies. Latin America wasn't initially the main focus, but they officially joined the party, so to speak, in 2017.
Okay, 2017. But you said the number jumped recently.
Yeah, exactly. It started kind of slow, but then it really picked up speed. By late 2021, you had 20 countries signed on. And like you said, now it's 22 out of 33 as of early 24. That's a significant chunk of the region.
That is a fast ramp up. Are there particular countries that are, major players in this? Any surprises in who joined or maybe who hasn't?
Argentina joining in February 2022 was definitely a big deal. It's a major economy down there. Colombia has also announced plans to get involved. Brazil is? Well, Brazil's interesting. There was talk early on they wouldn't join. But more recently, it seems like they might be reconsidering, maybe leaning towards joining after all. Still a bit unclear, that one.
Okay. So where's the money actually going? What kind of projects are we seeing?
A lot of it is fundamental infrastructure. Ports building new ones, upgrading old ones, highways connecting different areas, railways for moving goods more efficiently, that kind of thing. And energy is huge, too. We're talking oil and gas, but also lithium, which is critical, right, for batteries. And renewables are also part of the mix.
Sounds like potentially transformative stuff for these economies. But I imagine the perspectives on why China is doing this differ quite a bit.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
China frames it as win-win. Mutual benefit, helping create a more multipolar world, boosting trade, cultural ties. That's their official line.
And the U.S. view?
The U.S. largely sees it through the lens of strategic competition. There's real concern about China building up influence, securing resources in a region the U.S. has historically seen as, well, its backyard. Washington tends to worry about China's long-term game versus maybe the U.S. focus on more immediate stability issues.
Okay, that sets the stage. Let's get into the impacts then. Economically, what has this surge in Chinese engagement actually meant for Latin America? Both good and maybe not so good.
The economic impact has been massive. Just look at trade. Back in 2000, Latin American exports to China were tiny, less than 2%. Now, China's the #1 trading partner for South America and #2 for Latin America overall, just behind the U.S.
Wow, that's a fundamental shift.
It really is. And there are predictions that trade could top, $700 billion a year by 2035? It's huge. It changes economic dependencies, negotiating power, potentially political alignments down the road.
And this ties into the commodities boom we heard about, right?
Right.
China needing raw materials.
Absolutely. China's hunger for commodities fueled a massive boom. Latin America became this critical supplier of soybeans, beef, sugarcane, and crucially, lithium, like we mentioned, copper too.
So lots of money flowing in from selling these resources, but is there a downside to that? Becoming too dependent?
That's the big worry for many. Relying too heavily on just exporting raw materials makes economies vulnerable. Prices go up, prices go down. It can also stifle the development of other industries, more value-added stuff. And then there's the debt. All these big projects are often funded by Chinese loans, and that raises the specter of the debt trap.
Right. The idea that countries could get so indebted they become beholden to China.
Exactly. Especially for countries already struggling economically like Venezuela. If they can't repay, China might gain leverage, maybe even controls over strategic assets like ports or infrastructure. We are seeing countries trying to renegotiate these debts, trying to get better terms.
Okay, so debt is a major concern. What about the projects themselves? The environmental impact, labor standards? I've heard criticisms there.
Yes. That's another significant area of concern. There are frequent criticisms about lower environmental and labor standards on some Chinese-backed projects compared to, say, those funded by Western institutions. A report by an organization called CICDHA looked at a bunch of projects and found nearly all contributed to problems like deforestation and water pollution.
Deforestation, water pollution, what kind of long-term effects are we talking?
Well, you could see lasting damage to biodiversity, chemical contamination of water sources, even changes to river flows that could cause floods or droughts. It's serious stuff.
And I remember seeing some comments online, like on Reddit, talking about issues on the ground.
Yeah, there have been anecdotal reports, things like poor construction quality in places like Bolivia, claims of unpaid wages for local workers, sometimes disrespect towards indigenous groups. These aren't universal, but they pop up. And it feeds into that broader concern you mentioned, economic dependency. Like in Chile, where such a high percentage of exports now go to China, it raises questions about vulnerability.
Let's pivot to the strategic side then. The U.S. is clearly watching all this closely. What are their main security worries?
From the U.S. perspective, it's fundamentally about strategic competition. China gaining a major foothold in the Western Hemisphere is seen as a direct challenge. There's a worry that China is playing a long game, building economic ties now that could translate into strategic advantages later.
And that dual-use infrastructure idea comes in here, right? Ports that aren't just for trade.
Precisely. The concern is that commercial ports built or run by Chinese firms near vital waterways, think Panama Canal, Strait of Magellan, the Caribbean, could potentially be used for military purposes in a crisis, maybe restricting U.S. naval access, for example. China's 2017 National Intelligence Law, which basically requires Chinese companies to cooperate with state intelligence, fuels these fears.
So people point to that law specifically.
Yes. And you saw the political focus on it, like Trump's claims about China and the Panama Canal, or Senator Rubio making Panama his first foreign trip. It highlights the U.S. anxiety.
Beyond ports, what about technology? 5G, surveillance systems?
That's another big one. The spread of Chinese tech, like Huawei's 5G, safe city surveillance networks, even port scanners from companies like Nuctech or ZPMC. The U.S. worries about data privacy, cybersecurity risks, potential backdoors for espionage. They've explicitly warned U.S. port operators about using some of this equipment.
It's not just on the ground either, is it? What about space?
Right. China's also boosting space cooperation in the region. They have satellite tracking stations, like the big one, Espacio Lejano in Argentina. U.S. intelligence is concerned these could have military applications, maybe spying on U.S. satellites or even supporting Chinese missile systems. Some have reported links to the People's Liberation Army.
And finally, on the strategic front, what about the impact on democracy in the region?
There's a U.S. concern that China's engagement model, which tends not to emphasize things like good governance or human rights records, well, that it can end up propping up authoritarian regimes. Countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. China provides economic alternatives, reducing the leverage the U.S. and others might have to push for democratic reforms.
That covers a lot of strategic ground. Let's bring it back down to the human level. What are the social impacts, the human rights issues connected to these BRI projects?
This is really crucial and often overlooked. A major recurring issue is the lack of proper consultation with local communities, especially indigenous groups, before projects even start. The CICDHA report found this was a widespread problem. Communities often find out about a massive dam or mine planned for their backyard only when the bulldozers arrive. Think of the Rucalú Dam in Chile or the Las Cristinas mine in Venezuela. Big controversies there.
And when people aren't consulted, that can lead to, well, serious problems down the line.
Absolutely. Displacement is a big one. People forced off their land, sometimes ancestral lands, with little compensation or say in the matter. That same report found about a quarter of the projects studied involved displacement. And even worse, people who do speak out, environmental defenders, community leaders, they can face threats, attacks, even murder. We've seen this tragically in places like Colombia with the Hidroituango Dam protests or Ecuador around the Mirador mine.
That's incredibly disturbing. And those Reddit comments you mentioned earlier, they touched on treatment of people too.
Yes, some of those anecdotal accounts mention things like alleged disrespect towards indigenous people, unfair labor conditions, environmental corners being cut, directly linking these issues to specific Chinese companies in places like Bolivia and Peru. It adds a personal dimension to the broader concerns.
Okay, so given all these complexities, the economic benefits, but also the debt, environmental, social, strategic concerns, how is the U.S. responding? And how are the Latin American countries themselves handling this balancing act?
Well, the U.S. is definitely paying more attention now. There are calls for more U.S. focus, more resources for Latin America. They've launched their own initiatives, so sort of alternatives to the BRI.
Like Build Back Better World.
Right, which then became the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII. And there's also the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity, APP, trying to offer a competing vision. Though it has to be said, the initial funding pledges for some of these, like B3W, were seen as quite limited compared to the scale of Chinese investment.
So the U.S. is trying to offer an alternative, but are Latin American countries forced to choose, U.S. or China?
Mostly, no. They're trying not to choose. Many countries in the region see engagement with both superpowers as being in their best interest, diversify partners, maximize economic opportunities, and frankly, sometimes U.S. warnings about China are met with skepticism. Some see it as like a new version of the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. telling them who they can and can't partner with, so many are trying to pursue a kind of strategic non-alignment. Play both sides, if you will.
Makes sense. Before we wrap up, are we seeing any changes in how China itself is approaching financing in the region? Any shifts there?
Yeah, there are some shifts happening. One noticeable thing is a recent slowdown in lending from China's big state-backed development finance institutions, the DFIs, especially since the pandemic. At the same time, you see some countries, like Ecuador, becoming maybe a bit more transparent about the terms of their Chinese debt.
Interesting. Is the lending stopping altogether?
Not entirely. Brazil, for instance, seems to still be a major focus for DFI loans, particularly for infrastructure and green economy projects. But there's this idea put forward by the Wilson Center, I think, that China's image might be shifting from being seen as just an ATM with endless cash to potentially being seen more as a debt collector, which could, create friction and clash with their influence goals.
Okay, a lot to process there. So if we had to boil it down, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive?
I'd say the big picture is this. China's influence in Latin America is undeniable. It's grown incredibly fast, and it presents this mix of genuine development opportunities alongside some really significant risks. We're talking risk related to debt, the environment, social impacts, and of course, the whole strategic competition angle with the U.S. Latin American nations are caught in the middle, trying to navigate this complex situation, grab the benefits, dodge the pitfalls.
Right. A really complex balancing act. And maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on.
Yeah, I think considering everything we've touched on, from the official reports down to those personal stories from Reddit, the big question is, how can these Latin American countries realistically balance the lure of Chinese investment and trade with the potential costs? Cost to their sovereignty, their environment, their communities. And maybe what's the most constructive role the U.S. can actually play in this evolving picture, beyond just sounding alarms?
Really important questions. Definitely food for thought. If this exploration of China's role in Latin America got you thinking, we really encourage you to keep digging. Maybe look into specific BRI projects in a country you're interested in. Think about where these trends might lead long-term for the region and for global politics. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.